Hello, my name's Mrs. Keenan, Science Director for Outward Grange Academies Trust. This is Lesson 3 from the Biology Topic 6, Inheritance. The title of the lesson is DNA and Inheritance, and this lesson is on both the combined and the triple science specifications. So I just want you to think for a second about what makes you unique. And I want you to look at the picture of these twin girls, and are these individuals unique? And I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to come up with some ideas. Okay, what did you come up with? So this word unique is used a lot, but what does it actually mean? Well, the dictionary definition for unique is being the only one of its kind, unlike anything else. So are those two twin girls the only one of their kind, unlike anything else? They look fairly similar to me. So could we argue that they aren't unique? But unless we're an identical twin, we are unique to everybody else. This gives us something to think about. Okay, during this lesson, we're going to explain some key terms in inheritance, because often the inheritance topic, students do badly on it because they just don't understand the keywords. There's lots of new language, but if you can grasp that new language, it's really quite straightforward. Then we're going to look in more detail at some Punnett Square diagrams. And we met these when we looked at sex determination, boys and girls, in the last lesson. But we're going to look at them in more detail, and we're going to start predicting the outcomes of some genetic crosses. Okay, so to get us going, I want you to have a look at this diagram. How many of the structures can you label? There's 5 boxes, and I want you to come up with the names or the words that go underneath each box. And I'm just going to give you 1 minute, starting now. Okay, how did you get on? So under box 1, you should have had the word cell. Now it's just pointing to the whole cell. Now I will forgive you if you wrote cytoplasm there, because if you look at the very tip of that arrow, it is pointing to just inside the cell membrane, and it could be forgiven for thinking it's pointing to the jelly-like substance that makes up the cytoplasm. Under box 2 then, you should have the word nucleus. It's pointing to everything inside that rectangle shape inside the cell. And under box 3, you should have had the word chromosome. Sorry, my transition didn't quite work then, did it? But you should have had the word chromosome. Under box 4, you should have had DNA. You might have got the word helix, but DNA on its own is fine. And under box 5, you should have had the word gene. And no gene starting with J, please, for inheritance. They're the ones you wear. G-E-N-E. And a short section of a chromosome is called a gene. So under box 3, you should have had chromosome. Okay, the genetic material in the nucleus of a cell is composed of a chemical called DNA. DNA is a polymer made up of 2 strands forming a double helix. The DNA is contained in structures called chromosomes. So you've got a picture of a cell with a nucleus labelled, and then enlarged from that nucleus you've got a chromosome, and enlarged from that chromosome you can see this double helix DNA polymer, which is 2 strands, and it's what is contained inside all genetic material. Chromosomes are made of DNA. A gene is a small section of the DNA on a chromosome. And each one of those genes codes for a particular sequence of amino acids, which makes up a specific protein. So if you look at the diagrams, at the top you've got this twisted double helix of DNA. Then it's been enlarged so you can see these letters, which are actually bases. 3 bases together make up an amino acid. You don't need to worry too much about the base letters unless you're doing triple science. But then if you enlarge that again, you can see these chains of amino acids which actually combine together in a specific sequence to make up a protein. And the whole reason we're learning about this is because if we can make proteins, we can synthesize and make new cells and grow and develop and reproduce. Okay, so I'm just going to give you 1 minute. Can you remember which words were written on each line? So there's 5 words in total, 1 minute. See what you can come up with. The diagrams on the right hand side will help you a little bit. Okay, so a gene is a small section of DNA on a chromosome. Each gene codes for a particular sequence of amino acids to make a specific protein. Should have had gene, DNA, chromosome, amino acids, and protein. Well done if you got all those right. Okay, so the human genome of an organism is the entire genetic material of that organism. So the entire human genome has now been successfully mapped. So we know every bit, every order of amino acids, every protein structure within the entire human body. But why do you think a lot of money and time was invested into mapping the entire human genome? Why did we bother? Why is it important to know this? 1 minute, jot down any thoughts you may have. Okay, the reasons why the human genome was mapped entirely, and lots of money was spent doing that, and years of research, is because if we know the genes that make up a human body, we can then link and find links between those particular genes and different types of diseases. If we can link the human genome to different diseases, we have a better understanding of how to treat and hopefully prevent those diseases, particularly inherited disorders, and we can trace the migration patterns of humans from the past. So we can find out how things have evolved and have a better understanding of what might happen in the future. Okay, moving on for a second then. I want you to think about all the differences. So we started off looking at the twins who are quite unique, and we agreed that actually, unless you are an identical twin, we are all unique because we're not identical to anybody else genetically. But I want you to think about the characteristics, the differences between you and all your classmates in one of your classes. And I want you to think about the causes of those differences. And what we can do is we can group those differences or those characteristics, as we call them in genetics, into two groups: genetic characteristics and environmental characteristics. And what we mean by genetic characteristics are characteristics that you inherited from your parents. You inherited from the gametes that fused together to make you. By environmental characteristics, we mean the way you live, things in the environment, nothing to do with your genetic makeup, but things that might be different about you because of the environment you live in. So I want you just to think for 2 minutes, can you come up with any examples of characteristics that you inherited from your parents and characteristics that are determined by the environment you live in? And if you get all that done in 2 minutes and you come up with some examples, see if you can think of any characteristics that might be impacted by both your genetic makeup and the environment you live in. 2 minutes starting now. Okay, I don't think you got quite 2 minutes then, did you? I think my timer for this slide was a little bit out, so apologies for that. But did you manage to come up with any? Now, I'm not going to ask you or give you any answers at this stage, but we are going to do a little activity that some of the ones you've just come up with might be included in. So just to remind us, genetic characteristics are characteristics that are only caused by the genes you have. Environmental characteristics are caused by your external surroundings. So, the following slide has 18 different characteristics on it. You're going to decide if each one is caused by the environment, genetics, or a combination of both. So very quickly, sketch out a table. You're going to have 3 columns. The first column is going to say genetic. The second column, environmental. The third column can just say both. And in a minute, I'm going to show you the 18 characteristics, and you've got to put them in one of the 3 columns. If you think they're caused by the genes you inherited from your parents, obviously they go in the genetic column. If you think they are caused by your surroundings, they go in the environmental column. And if you think they could be caused by a combination of both, they can go in the both column. Okay, so just sketch it out very roughly, or just make 3 separate lists on your paper. It doesn't have to be beautiful. If you want to pause the video, if you want to just make your tables a little bit tidier, that's fine. But the 18 characteristics are hair colour, eye colour, accent, tattoos, scars, height, mass, ability to roll your tongue, dimples, freckles, colour blindness, blood type, piercings, religion, earlobe attachment, which sports teams you support, sex, as in whether you're a boy or a girl, and hair length. 3 minutes to decide which column, genetic, environmental, or both, each of those 18 characteristics fit into. I'm going to give you a little bit longer just to finish that off. Some of you might have still been finishing your tables off. Dave, if you've not quite done, you can pause the video. Okay, so I asked you to come up with 3 columns in your table: genetic, environmental, and both, and these are how I split them up. So, starting with genetic, if you can roll your tongue or not, you inherit that ability from your parents. You can't change it, you can't practice it and learn how to do it, so it is genetic. If you see in colour or you are colourblind, is genetic. The colour of your eyes is genetic. And I know you can get these fancy contact lenses that can make your eyes look blue, but you're not changing the permanent colour of your eyes, so it's still classed as genetic. Whether you have freckles on your skin or not is genetic. The blood type that the blood in your body is genetic. Whether you're a boy or a girl, so the sex of you is genetic. Whether you have dimples in your cheeks when you smile is genetic. And whether your earlobe is attached to the side of your head or it actually hangs loose is genetic. The characteristics that are determined by your surroundings, the environment, would be things like scars, which might be caused by accidents, tattoos, which you've chosen to have, the accent that your voice takes, which depends where you live, or the people you spend time with, the sports teams you support, any piercings you've chosen to have on your body, and any religious beliefs. Now, obviously, religious beliefs, you might have the same religious beliefs as your family and your parents, but they are still determined by your surroundings. You could change them at any time. Then the characteristics which fit into both groups are your hair length. Some people have naturally gorgeous long hair. Some people's hair grows much slower. You can obviously have your hair cut. So it is affected by genetics, but it's largely determined by your environment. The height and the mass of your body is determined largely by your genetics. So some families are just very, very tall. Some families, everybody's quite short. Some families, everybody's stick thin despite what they eat. Some families aren't that lucky and they put weight on more easily. But you can also determine the height and mass by eating a balanced diet, doing regular exercise. So those 2 characteristics come under both. And the colour of your hair, obviously it's genetic if we're talking about natural hair colour, but you may choose to have your hair dyed, so then we do tend to put hair colour in both. If it said natural hair colour, it would have gone across into genetics. So lots of characteristics, lots of differences between us that fit into one of those 3 groups. Okay, moving back to drawing genetic diagrams and genetic language for a minute then. So all the characteristics that are different about us are inherited from our parents if they are caused by genetics. So we're going to think about our genetic makeup for this slide. I'm going to talk about the word dominant. Now, if you think about the meaning of the word dominant, if you said somebody's dominant, you might think of words like strong, controlling, perhaps a little bit bossy. If you're a very dominant character, you'd take a lot of the limelight sometimes. You'd like your opinions to be heard. And it's a similar meaning when we're talking about alleles. Now, an allele is just a different version of a gene. So in the last lesson, we talked about eye colour and we talked about gender. Well, for gender, the alleles would be male or female. And for eye colour, the alleles might be green, brown, blue. So they're all for the characteristic eye colour, but the different versions of the gene are called alleles. And if they are dominant alleles, only one of them is required for the feature to be expressed. So remember, genes, alleles are in pairs. If one of them is dominant, that characteristic will be expressed. So for example, if somebody has brown eyes, for the pair of alleles for eye colour, one allele might be brown and one might be blue. But because brown eyes is dominant, that person will show to have brown eyes. When we're talking about how we're going to write down those alleles, we're going to use capital letters, big letters, dominant letters, capital letters. So we'd use a capital B to represent brown because it's the dominant allele. If one allele is capital B, that individual will have brown eyes. Obviously, if both alleles are capital B, that individual will also have brown eyes. So it can be big B, little b, or two big Bs, and that individual would have brown eyes. When we're talking about recessive alleles, if somebody's quite recessive, they might step back. They might be quite quiet, quite passive, not speak out as much as somebody who's more dominant. And if you are a recessive allele, or you have a recessive allele, both of your alleles need to be recessive for that feature to be expressed. So let's go back to my example of eye colour. If you had blue eyes, the blue allele for eye colour is recessive, so both of those letters would need to be recessive. And we represent recessive alleles using lowercase letters. So in my eye colour example, the person who had blue eyes must have small b, because both of the alleles need to be a lowercase letter for a recessive allele to be expressed. Is also homozygous because the letters are the same, two small b's. Okay, so just look at these pairs of alleles, and I just want you very quickly to decide, are they homozygous or are they heterozygous? And if you think they are homozygous, can you also tell me if they are homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive? So I'm just going to give you 10 seconds for number one, Capital B, homozygous or heterozygous? If it's homozygous, is it homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive? Okay, if you got homozygous, you are absolutely right. And it is homozygous dominant because the letters are capital letters. Okay, number 2, big B, little b, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. Okay, have you done that one? Brilliant. If you got heterozygous, you should have known that hetero means different. The letters are different, one capital, one lowercase, so it must be heterozygous. And last but not least, small b. Write your answers down. Okay, if you went for homozygous recessive, you are absolutely right, because 2 little letters mean recessive alleles and they are both the same, so it has to be homozygous recessive. Well done if you got those right. These keywords are really, really important. Okay, so your challenge outcome for this lesson was to look at key inheritance terms. And we've got 5 here that we've met at various points throughout this lesson. We've got chromosome, gene, allele, recessive and dominant. And I just want you to look at the 5 definitions and decide which word goes with which definition. If you want to write them all out, that's fine. Alternatively, you can just write number 1. If you think chromosome is a different form of a gene, you can just write 1 equals A. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to try and come up with the definitions for each of the 5 words, starting now. Okay, if you've come up with some answers, you could write the statements out and leave space for the words when you've checked you've got them right. It would make useful revision when you look back on this later on in the unit. These keywords come up in exam questions all the time. Okay, you've probably had enough time. So number 1, chromosome then, matches a long strand of DNA. Do you remember from previous slides, chromosomes are made up of DNA. So a chromosome is a strand of DNA. A gene is a short section of a chromosome. So if you broke a chromosome up into smaller sections, you would have genes. An allele is a different form, sometimes called a different version of a gene. Recessive, if a recessive allele is going to be expressed, you need to have two of those recessive alleles. So needs two of the same allele to be expressed, and often represented by a lowercase, represented by a lowercase letter. And dominant only needs one allele in a pair to be expressed. So it could be two capital letters, but a capital letter and a small letter, so long as the dominant would result in the dominant allele being expressed. If you want to pause the video if you get those down, that's fine. Okay, four more words then. Homozygous, heterozygous, genotype and phenotype. Homozygous and heterozygous you've met before. Genotype and phenotype you probably haven't, but just match the numbers to the letters. Try and come up with the correct definitions for these four words. I'm just going to give you 2 minutes because there's a few less words than there was on the last slide. Starting now, off you go. Okay, just finish off then. And you're probably done. So, homozygous then. Homozygous, two alleles in a pair that are the same. They're either both dominant or both recessive. Heterozygous, C, two alleles in a pair are different. So one's dominant and one's recessive would be written as one capital letter, one lowercase letter, whereas the homozygous would either be two capitals or two lowercase. Genotype, this is a combination of alleles that decides the phenotype. So if you think about eye colour, big B, for brown eyes, that is the genotype for that person's eye colour. The two letters, if you like. The phenotype then is the physical characteristic that genotype delivers. So for example, brown eyes or blue eyes or freckles or no freckles. So the genotype is the two letters, and those letters determine the phenotype, which is the physical characteristics. And I still remember this. Phenotype starts with P, so it's physical, which also starts with P, whereas genotype starts with G, and it's the genes, the genetics, the letters. Okay, so if you want to pause it and write any of those down, do. Okay, so what would the eye colour be of the following three individuals? So we looked previously at whether the pairs of alleles are homozygous or heterozygous, but now we're looking at what would the eye colour be. I've given you a reminder, brown is dominant and you only need one. Blue is recessive and you need 2 recessive alleles. So 1 minute, what would the eye colour be of person 1, person 2 and person 3 if these were their genotypes for eye colour alleles? Okay, so the first one, person number 1, big B, little b. Big B is brown, it's dominant, so you only need 1 of them. So person 1 would have brown eyes. Person 2, again, would have brown eyes. You only need 1, but it's got 2 alleles for brown eyes, 2 capital letters. And person 3 would have blue eyes because you need 2 recessive alleles to be blue, and recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. So person 1 brown, heterozygous. Person 2 brown, homozygous dominant, and person 3 blue, recessive, homozygous. Okay, so looking at the Punnett squares then, just a reminder, we write the parents' alleles at the top or on the side. This one's got dad at the top and mum on the left. It doesn't matter which way round they go. We then write the parents' genotype, or the 2 allele letters, at the top and down the side, and then we do the cross in the 4 window panes for what the offspring would be. So the question here asks you, what is the probability your child would have blue eyes? Well, in the first box, you've got brown eyes, homozygous dominant. The second box, we've got brown eyes, but heterozygous because the letters are different. In the third box, we've got brown eyes, but heterozygous because the letters are different. And in the final box, we've got blue eyes, homozygous recessive. Remember, if it's a recessive trait, both alleles need to have the allele for that trait. So 1 in 4 would be the probability of that child having blue eyes. Remember, it's either 1 over 4 or 1.3 is the ratio, or just do it as a percentage. It will be 25% blue eyes or 75% if the question asked about brown. But be really, really careful what the question's asking. That question was asking about blue eyes. Okay, so the answer will be 25%. 4 minutes to do question 1, then we'll go through it and I'll give you the same amount of time to do question 2. Good luck. Okay, I've stopped you a little bit before your 4 minutes is up because I imagine some of you have finished and some of you are really stumped. So I'm just going to give you a couple of pointers for question 1. So the mum was heterozygous and dad was homozygous recessive. So you should have put mum down as a capital letter and a small letter, a capital B and a small b, because I've suggested you use the letter B. And you should have put dad down as 2 small b's because he's recessive and homozygous means the same. So I'm just going to give you 1 more minute now. You should have mum as capital B, small b, and well done if you got that right. And you should have dad as 2 small p's. And I've just reminded you with the table of what your Punnett Square needs to look like. So I'm going to give you 1 more minute now to try and complete the question if you were struggling, or to check your answer if you've already done it. Okay, so mum, heterozygous, means different, so different letters, 1 capital letter, 1 lowercase letter. I suggested you use B, so capital B, small b. Dad, homozygous, recessive. So homozygous means the same letters. Recessive means they are lowercase. So you should have had small b, small b. And then if you do the cross, you should have ended up with big B, small b for the first box, 2 small b's for the second box, big B, small b for the third box, and small b for the last box. So it asked about eye colour. So you could say 25% blue eyes, or 50% blue eyes, or 50% brown eyes, or 1.1, or 1/2. And whether it's blue or whether it's brown, in this example, the proportion is the same, but really you should write blue eyes to brown eyes. If you do a ratio, or 50% of the offspring would be brown-eyed, or 50% would be blue-eyed if you use a percentage. And my advice would always be to use a percentage. Now, the letter chosen isn't important. I did make a suggestion you use B, but if you're not given a letter, just come up with something sensible. Just be careful if it's a letter like S. Capital S and small s can look very similar, so you're better off using a letter where the capital letter is different to the lowercase letter, like a D or a B. Works really, really well. Okay. Example 2 then. I asked you to think about dimples, and you were told dimples was dominant. You were told mum was homozygous dominant. You were told dad was homozygous recessive, and you've been asked to use the letter D to represent the alleles. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes now to complete the table and tell me what percentage of the offspring would have dimples. 2 minutes starting now, off you go. Okay, that's half your time up, 1 minute remaining. Don't forget to add in the percentage of the offspring that would have dimples. Okay, brilliant. So, mum, homozygous, so the same letters. Dominant, so two capital letters. You were told to use D, so capital D, capital D. Dad, homozygous, the same letters again, but this time recessive, so it's going to be two lowercase letters. You were told to use D, so little d, little d. And then the offspring would be capital D, small d in the first box, capital D, small d in the second box, capital D, small d in the third box, and capital D, small d in the next box, in the final box. Dimples was dominant, so 100% of that couple's offspring would have dimples. And just a note there, the letter D is given, so it must be used. If you decided to just use a different random letter, you would lose marks. If you're not given a letter, you do get to choose. Okay, just a final thing that I've put into this lesson then. Sometimes on exam questions, students get sideswiped a little bit because a diagram comes up that's called a family tree. And there's lots of information on a family tree, but it's not difficult. So I just want you to look at this family tree, and you've got couple A and B who have 4 children. And I want you to unpick the key and tell me as much as you can about individuals A, C, and F, just to see if you can understand this family tree. And I'm just going to give you 1 minute to do that. Okay, time's up. So for individual A, you should have put that they are male, and you know that because it's a square, and they suffer from the genetic disorder. Individual C, again, is male and suffers from the genetic disorder. And individual F, again, is male and does not suffer from the genetic disorder. The keys there, female, male, with or without the genetic disorder. You're looking at shapes and you're looking at black or white, and you're looking at those two keys separately to one another. So any of the squares are men, males. Any of the black shapes have the genetic disorder, any of the white shapes don't, and any of the circles are females. The mistake students make is when these questions come up, they're really simple, but they don't take time to fully digest the key. And it's really important that you do that. And we'll do more about these in a later lesson. Okay, finally then, we're nearly there. It's been quite a long lesson, this one. I want you just to think now for some definitions for these 5 terms. I'm going to give you 1 minute and this is the lesson finished. So definitions for these 5 words. If you want to go back and look in your notes, feel free. 1 minute starting now. Okay, time's up. So starting off then with the word allele. An allele is a different version or a different form of a gene. So a dominant allele is only apparent in the offspring even if only one of the alleles is inherited. So it would be shown as the phenotype in the offspring even if only one of the alleles is dominant, and you might have written represented by a capital letter. A recessive allele would be shown in the phenotype of the offspring only if both the alleles were recessive. So they both have to be recessive for a particular characteristic for the phenotype to show the recessive trait. Homozygous then, both alleles are the same. So they have two identical alleles. Could be homozygous dominant, could be homozygous recessive, but the alleles are the same. And heterozygous are individuals which have different alleles, represented by one capital letter and one small letter. So there's an awful lot of new vocabulary in this lesson, an awful lot of words to get your head around. Feel free to go back and watch it again, get those definitions down. A really good use of your time would be to learn some of these keywords and definitions before you move on to the next lesson. Brilliant, well done, keep going. Genetics is hard, but if you understand the language, it's actually really, really simple.